Chapter 24. The Uses of Participles. Chapter 24 covers the following: the formation and use of the ablative absolute, the formation and use of the passive periphrastic, and the dative of agent. At the end of the lesson, we'll review the vocabulary which you should memorize in this chapter. There are 4 important rules to remember in this chapter. Rule 1. Ablative absolutes come in 3 basic forms. With x is a noun, having been y'd, y is a verb. With x ying, and with x as x2 or z, where x2 is a second noun and z is an adjective. Rule 2. Ideally, the noun or subject of an ablative absolute is absolute from the main sentence, meaning it's not a constituent in it. Rule 3. The passive periphrastic carries a sense of obligation or necessity, best translated as must or have to. Rule 4. The passive periphrastic expects a dative of agent with no preposition. This chapter marks an important turning point in your study of Latin. Henceforth, we'll focus on syntax, how words go together, over formation, how individual words are created. In other words, our attention will move away from building new types of words. Not that there aren't new forms still to come. There's an infinitive or 2, adverbs, and the whole subjunctive mood is lurking ahead. But overall, we'll spend more time learning how to use what we've already got in new and productive ways, especially in forming various types of clauses. And the first of these new pieces of syntax is the ablative absolute, one of the simplest constructions in Latin. It's yet another use of the ablative that's equivalent to English with, but with in a sense we haven't encountered yet, what grammarians call the absolute construction. In essence, an ablative absolute is made up of 2 ablatives, most often a noun and a participle, which stand apart from the grammar of the main sentence. Thus, it's called an absolute, a term derived from the Latin word absolutum, the perfect passive participle of the verb absolvere, to detach. Thus it means having been detached. Let's talk about how ablative absolutes are formed before we explore why they have to be detached from the grammar of the main sentence. The why will make more sense after you've seen the how. There are 3 major types of ablative absolute. The type found most often in Latin uses an ablative noun and an ablative perfect passive participle, creating a phrase that translates literally into English as with the noun having been verbed. The second most common type employs a present participle in place of the perfect passive participle with the noun verbing. The last and least frequent type combines either 2 nouns in the ablative or a noun and an adjective, both in the ablative, with noun 1 as or being noun 2, or with the noun as or being the adjective. Let's look first at the most common type of ablative absolute, with the noun having been verbed. For example, with this having been done. The noun or subject of the ablative absolute is this. Its participle or verb is having been done. In Latin, this would be hoc facto. Here's another example. With the city having been rescued. In Latin, that would be urbe erepta. Note that because this type of ablative absolute has a passive participle, it expects an agent, for instance, by the Greeks. In Latin, a Graecis. The second most common type of ablative absolute uses a present active participle, following the formula with the noun verbing. For instance, with them coming, which Latin would render as eis or illis venientibus. Here's another example, with Caesar listening, which in Latin would be Caesare audiente. This type of ablative absolute uses an active participle, so it expects a direct object. For example, Caesare amicos audiente, with Caesar listening to his friends. Or the participle can have after it anything that naturally follows it. For example, an indirect object, with Caesar giving presents to his friends. Finally, an ablative absolute can have only two nouns, or a noun and an adjective, that is, no participle, with a noun being or as another noun, or with a noun being or as an adjective. For example, with Cicero as citizen. In Latin, that's cicerone cive. Or with the end being certain, which in Latin would be fine certo. The second noun or adjective acts like a predicate nominative, but in the ablative case, because its subject, the thing to which it refers, is ablative by the rules of this construction. This type of ablative absolute would be a minor variation not worth noting in a beginning Latin class if it weren't for the fact that Latin has no word equivalent to being. Without a present participle for sum, the Romans can't say with Caesar being general. They're forced to say with Caesar general. So the two ablative noun variation of the ablative absolute occurs much more often in Latin than the equivalent construction happens in English, which is all but never. What an ablative absolute, let's abbreviate that A squared and save ourselves a lot of ink and air. What an A squared really shows is, according to grammarians, attendant circumstance. Something that's happening around and may in some way affect the message of the main sentence. But the reason the attendant circumstance is being mentioned is not necessarily stated explicitly. It can be, and often is, implied. That is, the speaker or writer assumes the connection between the main sentence and the attendant circumstance is clear and doesn't have to be expressed as such. And sometimes Roman writers are just being coy and trying to say something without actually saying it. Ablative absolutes are very good for that. So what are the implications of those attendant circumstances? Well, an ablative absolute like with Caesar as general can imply cause. Thus, interpreting that ablative absolute as since Caesar was the general makes sense, particularly if the main sentence goes on to say something like, the Romans defeated the Gauls. But in other circumstances, an A squared may merely show circumstance, not cause, in which case it's best to translate this A squared as, when Caesar was general, Rome experienced civil turmoil or something like that. An A squared can also imply an unexpected outcome, in which case it's called concessive. And it's best to use although in the English translation. Although Caesar was general, the Romans were defeated. Now that you understand how ablative absolutes are formed, we can talk about why the subject or noun of the A squared can't be part of the main sentence. The reason for this is very simple. If the noun recurs in the sentence, there's no need for an A squared. Just attach the participle to the noun. Why create a separate absolute construction when you don't have to? So if there's any way to incorporate into the main sentence the thought embodied in an A squared, do it. Often it's possible to use the direct object or some other noun in the A squared, not just its subject. In theory, nothing in the A squared should reappear in the main sentence. So, it's wrong to say, with Caesar leading the army, Caesar defeated the Gauls. Instead of creating an A squared, just attach the participial phrase, leading the army, to the word Caesar in the main sentence, and say, Caesar, while leading the army, defeated the Gauls. Again, it's wrong to say, with Caesar leading the army defeated the Gauls. In this case, make the participle leading passive, having been led, and attach it to army in the main sentence. Then change Caesar from subject to agent, resulting in having been led by Caesar, the army defeated the Gauls. Here again, it's important to understand how to shift correctly back and forth between relative and absolute time, because changing ablative absolutes into clauses entails converting participles which show relative time to finite verbs in clauses that reflect absolute time. So, for instance, with Caesar coming, the enemy fled. When is the enemy's fleeing happening? In the past. So when is Caesar's coming happening? At the same time, the past. How then do you change with Caesar coming into a when clause with the finite verb? What tense do you use? The past, of course. When Caesar was coming, the enemy fled. And how about with Caesar having been killed, no one rejoiced? A giant lie, but let's go with it. Change the a squared into a clause starting with after. After Caesar is killed? Was killed? When is the killing happening relative to the rejoicing or lack thereof? Before it, of course. And the main verb is past tense. So what tense in absolute time shows action prior to the past? The pluperfect. After Caesar had been killed, no one rejoiced. I told you relative versus absolute time would keep coming up in this class, and this isn't the last time. Just wait until the next chapter. Yikes! The second participle-based construction introduced in this chapter is the passive periphrastic. We've already encountered the term periphrastic, meaning something that's a long way of saying a simple thing, when we talked about the future active periphrastic, I am going or about to do something, a circuitous trek around the simpler expression, I will do it. The word comes from Greek, where peri means around, Latin uses circum to say the same, and phrase means speak. In Latin, that's locute, from a verb we haven't studied yet, but will. So, periphrasis is the Greek equivalent of our Latin-based word circumlocution. Do you know what circumlocution means? If not, learn it now. The act of speaking around a topic, that is not addressing a subject directly, usually for some underhanded reason. But with the passive periphrastic, there's nothing underhanded at hand. Just a construction that takes more words than necessary to say a simple thing, and uses the passive. In this case, with the meaning must be or have to be. The upshot is that Latin can't say must or have to, the active forms, at least not using this construction. The Romans had to use the passive voice if they wanted to say must this way. Or to put it the way Latin would, the passive voice had to be used by the Romans if they wanted to say must this way. Get it? Now, they did have other ways of expressing the idea of necessity, but they liked the passive periphrastic and used it a lot, in spite of its innate restriction, its passivity. The formula for the passive periphrastic is very simple. Take the gerundive, which is just another name for the future passive participle, one of the forms we learned in the previous chapter, and add a form of the verb esse. Therefore, it means literally, is to be done. Thus, a more accurate name for this construction would be the gerundive of obligation or necessity. Whether that's a better name, I don't know. I can hear the groans from here, so I'm guessing it's not. Seriously, you prefer passive periphrastic? Oh, you don't like either. Okay then, let's give it another name. How about Andy? Then maybe you'll remember that it has an ND in the participle. Necessary Andy. I don't care what you call it, as long as you learn it. And here are some examples of Andy in action. Caesar laudandus est, meaning Caesar must or has to be praised. Veritas narranda est, meaning the truth must or has to be told. Bellum gerendum erat, meaning the war had to be waged. Note in the last example that you can't say must have been waged, because that construction doesn't carry a sense of obligation, but probability. English has an odd convention in which must in the present shows obligation, but in its past tense forms denotes likelihood. Compare he must go, obligation, versus he must have gone, probability. So Latin's not the only language with necessary weirdness. Note also that all these gerundives, future passive participles, in passive andes are really predicate nominatives, and as such must agree in number, gender, and case with the subject. That means they'll change form as the subject changes. See how all the gerundives here have the same gender as the subjects they go with? Laudandus is masculine to go with Caesar. Naranda is feminine to go with veritas, and gerundum neuter to go with bellum. As you can see, the same is true of number. So what if bellum, in the last example, were plural, bella, wars? Well, first that means the verb would have to become errant. But how would changing the number of bellum affect the gerundive? Of course, it would have to become gerenda to agree with bella. So let's review. The most complicated thing about passive periphrastics is learning to spell periphrastic. Just take the nd form of the verb, the gerundive or future passive participle, add some incarnation of the verb esse to be, and you have one way of saying must be or have to be in Latin. There are a few other things to remember too. In the past tense in English, you can't use must because must have shows probability, not necessity. And this is a passive periphrastic. You can't say just must this way, only must be. And here's another odd feature of Andy the passive periphrastic. To say by, as in, it has to be done by you, the passive periphrastic doesn't use an ablative of personal agent, but a dative of agent. For example, Caesar nobis laudandus est. Caesar must be praised by us. As a rule, the dative expresses agent only with passive periphrastics, although later classical Roman authors extended the practice to all passive forms, just to be cute, I guess, and to make our lives more difficult. You can ignore that sad fact of history for now. In this class, the dative of agent will occur only with a passive periphrastic. Let's look at some examples of passive periphrastics with datives of agent. Translate the following sentences, please. Bella nemini gerenda sunt. What does that mean in Latin? That's right. Wars must be waged by no one. Nemini is a dative of agent. Next sentence. Graeci Romanis iuvandi erant. Translate, please. The Greeks had to be helped by the Romans. Romanis is a dative of agent. Also note, you have to say had to here, since it's past tense. Another sentence. Urbs vobis delenda erit. Erit? Whoa! How can you incorporate a future tense form of esse into a passive periphrastic? Can you say in English, will, must? No, of course not. So, you will have to use will have to, won't you? The city will have to be destroyed by y'all. Finally, let's address the ramifications of this unusual way of expressing necessity in Latin. This periphrastic that must be passive, where the Latin construction has to be expressed in the passive, the English does not. English can use the active, making it good practice to change the voice when rendering our friend Andy into English. That way you avoid over-literal, stilted translations. Take, for example, this sentence. Veritas omnibus narranda est. Literally this means, the truth must be told by everyone. But better English allows, indeed demands, the active equivalent. Everyone must tell the truth. Going back to our previous sentences, Let's practice converting passive paraphrastics into active voice constructions in English without changing the meaning of the sentence. Start with the first sentence. Bella nemini gerenda sunt. Literally, wars must be waged by no one. Change the English sentence to active, please. How do you do that? Well, take the subject in green and make it the direct object. Then take the agent in red and make it the subject. The result is, no one must wage wars, or no one ought to wage wars. Next sentence. Graeci Romanis iuvandi erant. Literally, the Greeks had to be helped by the Romans. Make the subject the direct object, and make the agent the subject. The Romans had to help the Greeks. Last sentence. Urbs vobis delenda erit. The city will have to be destroyed by y'all. Make it active. Y'all will have to destroy the city. Got it? It's not hard to do. It's just weird that you have to do it. Or in Latin, it has to be done by you. And what case would by you be if that were a Latin sentence? Good. Dative. End of grammar. Now let's look at the vocabulary for this chapter. The first word is dux ducis masculine, meaning leader, guide, commander, or general. It's a third declension masculine noun. The question is it I stem? No. It is monosyllabic in its nominative singular, but it doesn't have two consonants at the end of its base. So what's its genitive plural? Excellent. Ducum, not ducium. The next word is imperium imperii, neuter, meaning power to command, supreme power, authority, command, or control. It's a second declension neuter noun. This is the term the Romans used for what the Senate gave a general who was assigned a legionary command. Thus, the Latin word for general, imperator, means literally commander, a man with imperium. What would the nominative plural of this word be? Good for you. Imperia. The next word is servus servi, masculine, meaning slave. It's a second declension masculine noun. There's nothing particularly interesting to say about it. So moving on. The next word is quisque quidque, about which there is much interesting to say, unfortunately. It's a pronoun meaning each one, or each person. You can see that it's actually a compound of quis, quid, who, what, and que, and. That is, the interrogative pronoun plus que, meaning literally and who. Somehow to the Romans, that betokened each, often used as a substantive, as in each is whatever, meaning each person is. Though Wheelock doesn't include it here, there is also an adjective form of this pronoun, quique, quaique, quodque, which is used when each modifies a noun. Naturally, the interrogative adjective qui, quae, quod replaces the interrogative pronoun quis, quid when each is used as an adjective with a noun expressed. Say, for instance, each speaker, quique orator. I won't test you on this, but it's not a bad thing to know. What is the genitive singular of quisque or quique? Yes, cuiusque. The next entry on this vocabulary list is a prefix, re, re, sometimes red, meaning back or again. It's seen often attached onto the front of Latin verbs, and consequently many English derivatives too. For example, remanio, repello, repugno, requiro, repeto, revoco, and relinquo, all of which have important English derivatives. The next word is another small, simple form, the interrogative adverb cur, meaning why. Originally, in early Latin, it was quor, a combination of the question form qua, here quo, and are, an adverbial ending seen also in English here and where. Next on this vocabulary list follows a series of verbs, the first of which is accipio accipere, accepi acceptum, meaning take, get, receive, or accept. It belongs to the third IO conjugation. This is clearly a compound formed by adding ad, meaning to or to oneself, to cipio, the vowel-gradated form of capio, meaning literally to take for oneself. The prefix ad really only intensifies the basic sense of capio. The next word is another compound of capio, this one using the prefix we just learned, re. Recipio, recipere, recepi, receptum, meaning take back, regain, admit, or receive. And just like capio and most of its compounds, it's third IO. The next two entries are also another pair of basic verb and compound, pello and expello. First, the basic verb, pello, pellere, pepuli, pulsum, meaning strike, push, drive out, or banish, its third conjugation. There are two things worth noting about its perfect active form, the third principal part, pepuli. First, there's only one L versus the two L's in the present base, because one of the L's in the present is really an N infix, signaling that the verb is present tense. Naturally, that's not carried into the perfect tense. Also, the perfect active reduplicates, adding PE to the front of the base, creating pepuli. The next verb is a compound of pello, expello, expellere, expuli, expulsum, meaning drive out, expel, or banish. Virtually the same thing as pello, so all the prefix really does is to intensify the verb's basic meaning. Like pello, expello is third. But notice one important difference. The perfect active of expello, expuli, does not reduplicate. The Romans during the classical age were in the process of removing reduplicated forms from Latin. Reduplication made no more sense to the average Roman than it does to you. And that process often began with compounds, which are easier to regularize than the often heard base verbs. Remember that the more a word is used, the greater the likelihood it will sustain irregularity. Or to put it the other way around, irregular forms will quickly regularize if they're not constantly being drummed into your dear little ear. Bonus points for anyone who gets that reference. The next word is quaero, quaerere, quaesivi, quaesitum, meaning seek, look for, strive for, ask, or inquire. It's a third conjugation verb, though its perfect active base, quaesiv, is more typical of fourth conjugation. Originally the base was quais, but in early Latin there was a process called rhoticism, in which a single S in between vowels changed to R. The result was that quaiso turned into quairo, but rhoticism didn't affect the perfect because it originally had two S's, quaesivi. The next word is relinquo, relinquere, reliqui, relictum, meaning leave, leave behind, abandon, or desert. It's a third conjugation verb. Note again that the present base relinqua has an N in it. That's the nasal infix present marker, which is lost in the perfect base reliqua. By now you should be getting used to that. The next word is cupiditas, cupiditatis. What gender does this word have to be in Latin? Feminine, of course, as are all third declension abstract nouns that end tas tatis. Cupiditas is the noun representing the abstract quality contained in the adjective cupidus, meaning eager for, greedy, desirous. So, cupiditas means desire, longing, passion, cupidity, or avarice. Compare the god Cupid, the personification of such feelings. The next word is another verb, narro, first conjugation, meaning tell, report, or narrate. How do you say about to tell in Latin? And since that's a participle, an adjective, we need to specify the number, gender, and case. Let's say masculine nominative singular. What type of participle is translated as about to? When is it happening? In the future, of course. Is it active or passive? No be, so it's active. How does Latin form the future active participle? The future is when you're going to do something, right? You're. Think about it. You are. So, the answer is narraturis. And the final word in this ridiculously long vocabulary list is rideo, ridere, risi, risum, meaning laugh or laugh at. It's a second conjugation verb. So what's the Latin for we will laugh? How is the future formed in second conjugation? Is it bi or e? It's bi. So the answer is ridebimus. Now make that third-person singular pluperfect passive, masculine. He had been laughed at. How many words do you need in Latin to make any perfect passive finite verb form? 2, the perfect passive participle, and a form of esse. But what form of esse? The perfect passive participle is -1 in time value. You need another -1 to make the pluperfect, which is -2. So you'll need the past tense of esse, third singular, and make sure the participle agrees with the subject, he. That would be risus erat. Finally, what do you think the English derivative risible means? It's an adjective. Yes, exactly. Laughable, absurd. No comment. Do the rules that were cited at the beginning of this chapter now make sense to you? If not, please review this presentation. If so, please proceed to the next slide. For the next class meeting, please bring in a copy of the worksheet for Chapter 24. Here's a link to that worksheet. Hoc perfecto multum a vobis susceptum atque vobis suscipiendum est.